Women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church.
Here, these Corinthian women are buying into the myth of the androgyne and the fall of Eve, and that she is inferior. This veil is a veil of modesty, but it's also of inferiority. Women need protection from the angels because they are not in the divine image.
Like if women are going to pray or speak in church, they should have their head covered.
But it's the alternative reaction to a more liberative, feminist movement of the early church, in which Paul becomes a champion of a woman.
Doctors Dennis R. MacDonald and Richard Carrier, I have a question. Women, how are they treated? Biblically, at least, let's focus on the New Testament. I think that's best since you guys are New Testament scholars. We are all for women's rights and equality and things like this, but we also know patriarchal systems. We still see it in the South today and in many areas in the United States. We're looking at moral issues with the New Testament and how women were treated. So would you take us into the subject and tell us what you see?
I mean, obviously there's a lot one can say about that, but and there's also, like, if you're going to study that historically, you'd want to compare it to what's going on in the wider environment. So there's like Judaism, there's like conservative Jewish views at this time that are very anti-woman. There's less conservative Jewish views that are actually more accepting and elevate women's status more. So you have even a debate on the status of women, even within Judaism, going on at this time when the New Testament is coming out. Then you also have the Greek view, and then you have the Roman view, and there's a lot of evolution in time where there's more acceptance of women's equality, but it's nowhere near equal yet, right? But it's just more, it's getting closer to that than it had been in times past. So there's a lot about that you could go into, and I have an article, if you go to my website and you go to the writings link on the menu, inside there under Jesus Studies, I have a whole article in there where I'm talking about Groothius's argument that Jesus should be included among the great philosophers and encyclopedias of philosophy, and I explain why that wouldn't make sense. And one of the points that I make in there is I talk about philosophy regarding women, and I show some examples of actual philosophy about women written in that time and how that differs completely from what we're seeing in the New Testament. But that at least gives you a baseline of what were the most acceptable views, what were the most progressive views at that time, which were still a little bit backward, but were more progressive than usual. And the examples are like Plutarch, for instance, to show both sides of this. Plutarch, in advice for bride and groom, he writes this little article for this couple getting married, and it's advice on how to get along in marriage. And I'll give you one example of something that sounds progressive, and then I'll shoot it right down by the worst part of the thing, that it's bad advice. But anyway, that tells you everything you need to know about the society at this time. The first part is, the good part, is when he says your wife should be as educated as you. It's important. You would have much greater meeting of minds, and your love will be stronger, and you'll respect each other, and she will be better off too, because she'll be protected from superstitions, like witches can't take advantage of her and stuff if she knows how astronomy works and things like that. So he has this whole section about how women should have the same education as men, and also how they should partake of the benefits of philosophical understanding, like all the things that we get out of philosophy, women should get too. Like they should have the same benefits. So for him, so he gets this whole education argument, and I say, oh wow, that's really progressive. That's great, and that's an example of how we see like the progress in terms of pushing women's equality at least closer to actual equality with men. But then there's another part in a completely different section of the same essay where he's about adultery, and he's telling the man, the groom, it's like, okay, don't cheat on your wife like that. Don't cheat on your wife with other men's wives or with other fathers' virgin daughters or any of that stuff. But like, just your slaves. Like that's respectable, right? And so this is like, seems like, oh, okay, you lost me there. So you have this whole class system, obviously, slaves as property that can be raped, whatever. But also it's this also attitude towards women can be subordinated whenever it's convenient for men to. And so you have this mixture of like some progressive ideas and still some sexist and misogynistic ideas in the wider culture. And of course, one of the Christian solves for this was to like really demonize sex altogether. So if you get rid of very narrow confines of when sex is even appropriate at all, then you kind of like bypass all of these other problems with aggressive and non-consensual sexuality, which is a big problem. And I have a whole article on this on my blog. I talk about sex and sexism in the Roman Empire. Sex and Sexism in Ancient Rome, I think is the title of it. And the task I was given in this particular case was to find polyamory, and like that's really progressive in ancient Rome. And I said, well, I don't think there's an example of that. But the challenge I found was finding any consensual sex in ancient Rome. And I go through it like pattern by pattern, step by step, as like increasingly more consensual arrangements that you find. And so you get this whole view of how the patriarchalism and the sexism of society is very much on display, and was much more overt and honest. Like they would just outright say it. They weren't trying to pretend it didn't exist or hide it or anything. Like they were just, no, yeah, men should be in charge. And we know women are actually just as smart as men, but we can't give them equal power because we don't want them to have power. That's basically like flat out. So flip context. Let's go to like the New Testament. When you see the New Testament you're reading today, the final form that gets in there, we have two passages in there that are relevant to this, and it's 1 Timothy chapter 2. I'll read that in a moment. And then there's a verse similar to it that we find in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. And this is Paul being represented to say, and I'll put it this way, this is 1 Timothy chapter 2, 9 to 15. I also want the women to dress modestly, with decency and propriety, adorning themselves not with elaborate hairstyles or gold or pearls or expensive clothes, but with good deeds, appropriate for women who profess to worship God. A woman should learn in quietness and in full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. Paul never wrote that. And it's important to note that Paul would have found that an abhorrent passage, because Paul himself, if you read Paul, the actual Paul, this authentic letters, he's much more egalitarian. He's much more, women can participate in church. Women can be prophets even. Women can give spiritual messages and have roles of authority in the church. So Paul is much more open to this egalitarian idea. Well, later, when you get to like the 2nd century, there are Christian factions that don't like this egalitarianism of Paul, and they want to go back to the sort of social sexual hierarchy. And so someone wrote this letter and put this in here. Let's shut these women up. And we have an example in Tertullian where he talks about in the Montanists, where women were allowed to have positions of authority and even speak for God and things like that. And he talks about like how we can't have that. That's actually not a good thing. Like we need to have, men need to be in charge of women, and there needs to be a proper social order. Even like we have to rise in our own fleshly bodies so that the inferiority of women can be preserved in the afterlife for all eternity. So this kind of sexism that's kind of mainstream around the general culture is reasserting itself, and it's actually sort of kind of eclipsing and dominating what Paul originally would have imagined and taught.
Can I just add something before you get to the 1 Corinthians text?
Yes, please do.
My first published book was called The Legend and the Apostle, and it argued that the pastor, that is the Pauline author writing in the 2nd century, this text and also 2 Timothy and Titus, opposed Paul's attitude toward women because he was also opposed to the story of Thecla, whom tradition Paul had commissioned to teach the Word of God, and that she set herself up as a faith healer and became a great saint of the church. And this part of Seleucia then became, in Asia Minor, became a cult site for people to come, and she became a teacher, and she taught the Word of God, it said. And this author doesn't like it. Yeah. And she could do that because she was a virgin and would not then be submissive to a husband in the same way that a married woman would. And so her celibacy and her fidelity to Paul, even though he was in danger of being killed, and by the way, she was also the proto-martyr among women. She was because she almost was killed in an amphitheater herself. Now, I can tell you that most of your fundamentalist friends have never heard of Saint Thecla. She's a major saint in Eastern Orthodoxy. She lost her stripes at Vatican II with a lot of other saints, but she was a saint of the Catholic Church for a long time. And the author of the Pastoral Epistles, in my view, wrote in Paul's name to say, no, women are not to have that authority. They're to keep quiet. And in fact, they're going to be saved by having babies.
Right.
Instead of virginity. So this, it's in the Bible, right? It's scripture for these people.
Yep.
But it's the alternative reaction to a more liberative, feminist movement of the early church in which Paul becomes a champion of a woman, and she becomes a faith healer and a teacher.
Yeah, that's spot on. It really illustrates the fact that we do have these alternative movements, and this is a reaction to another version of Christianity that was earlier and just didn't like it, right? And it wasn't the one that won the culture war, basically.
This is really insightful. Okay, the combination of what you guys just did really blows. What I do when I listen to this is I try to put my fundamentalist cap on. What can I do? This is scripture, and if Paul didn't write it, what is it then? Do I trust it? It's in Paul's name, and this is the problem. I hope that what you guys are saying will pierce someone's hard head, like my head was 9 years ago, and maybe let some of this evidence start to get in.
Okay, let's be a little harder-nosed about it. Okay. 1 Timothy is a forgery.
Okay.
He's going out of his way to say that I am the apostle.
He's lying.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now,
Right.
What about this Corinthian thing? Let's take a deeper dive, and you can hurt my fundamentalist feelings.
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's have it in right context here. A lot of his teaching is about allowing people to speak and having this mutual respect. And he says, which we'll get to later, about covering the head is one of the things. I'll land with that. But first, one of the points is that he says about Christ is the head of the man is the head of the woman. And oftentimes that verse is just quoted by itself as showing that, men should be in charge of women. But the whole context, he's talking about how married couples should be respectful of each other and listen to each other and so on. And so it's more like head of household, like the man, usually in this context, the man is bringing in the money, and so he's got to make decisions financially and so on. And women should be respectful of that. But they should also be respectful of what women have to say. So it's not this straightforward, men are the boss, women should shut up. That's not in there. That's not part of it. But when you get to 1 Corinthians 14, you run into this verse, and if you really pay close attention to the text, it doesn't even fit in the context, but it's thrown in there. It's thrown in here. He's talking about rabble-rousing in the church, people interrupting each other, basically. He's talking about prophets are having spiritual visions, and then they start interrupting each other. And he says, we got to have peace in the church. You got to be order. Come up with some sort of orderly system. Parliamentary. Come on, people. It's kind of what he's saying. But thrown in the middle of this, he says, women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says. I don't know what law he's talking about. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church. Now, there are a number of reasons why we believe this is an interpolation. Many scholars have pointed this out. I have a whole chapter on the interpolations in Paul in Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ, my book, and this is one of the ones that I talk about. And we have some, actually do have some manuscript evidence. It's not quite as clear, but there is some supporting it. But it's also, contextual argument. It doesn't fit where it goes. But also it directly contradicts Paul, because I think like the chapter before, he's talking about women speaking in church as if there's no big issue with it. So obviously Paul doesn't have a problem with women speaking in church. In fact, one of the examples is when they're speaking, their head should be covered.
That's exactly right.
Right. So it's like, well, wait a minute. What is this stuff about don't permit women to speak in church? So this is clearly, and you notice how this,
head coverings?
right? You notice how this clearly reflects 1 Timothy. Like this sounds almost like a paraphrase of 1 Timothy that someone has just slammed in there amongst Paul's rules for the church. So someone wanted to basically lie and make it seem like Paul said this, and he did not say this. And it's really important to note that this is a forged interpolation. It's not something that Paul would not have agreed with this. He would have said, no, that's absolutely not the way to go forward.
How do you deal with that, right? Like we're going above and beyond, benefit, actually trying to find out what really was said, and the critical method of splicing this thing and tearing it apart, realizing what really probably belonged there originally, is so much more moral. What we're doing by dissecting the Bible is so much more moral than the people who go, gotta stay in there. And it's like,
Yeah, and I'll say, like, I don't want to, like, sit here and say that Paul was some sort of, like, totally not sexist, total progressive mind. Like, that's not the case. But he was closer to the progressive mindset than his being made to depict here. So, like he actually was more forward-thinking about the treatment of women in the church. The real Paul, that is. But the later church didn't like that. They wanted to go back to the mainstream, submissive women model, and so they started lying. They made Paul say things that he didn't say. That would have been deeply offensive to Paul originally. But one of the reasons, as I mentioned, that we know that this is false is in a previous chapter, or earlier chapter, he talks about, like, if women are going to pray or speak in church, they should have their head covered. Mind you, he says only in church. He's not saying that women should have a hijab all the time. But he's saying, like, in church, for particular reasons, women should have their head covered, which is one gender distinction he does make. Now, I'm going to throw it over to Dennis MacDonald to talk about this rather interesting detail.
Well, first of all, I want to make two comments. One is I think Richard is entirely right about the interpolation in 1 Corinthians. And someone who's trying to harmonize a Pauline corpus that included the pastorals apparently recognized the difference between what Paul says in the pastorals, and this is his final instructions to his best buddy, Timothy, soon before he dies. This is the final word, just like the final words of Moses in the Pentateuch, right? It has a particular validity. Well, maybe this shows a more mature Paul, and so you have this harmonization going on. So I don't think in 1 Corinthians the issue is misogynistic. I think it has to do with a synthetic Paul to make him consistent.
Right, I see what you mean, yeah.
And so I don't know that we have to give a sinister response. Now, the other thing is I want to say, I am male, you are male, you are male, and we're talking about issues about women. It would be enriched, surely,
Absolutely.
if we had a different gender represented. And because I'm a strong believer in historicist readings that are gendered.
Yeah.
And so we need to take that into account. So that, I think, we just need to come clean on, and that we ought not to be speaking for women interpreters. So I'll just start there. The next thing to say is that this business about why women have to wear veils on their heads because of the angels surely means the angels want to fuck with them unless they're protected. So why do you have this veil? Tertullian actually tells us why, because when you have Adam and Eve split up, Eve is the one who sins. And there's a tradition already by the time of Tertullian that the Virgin Mary undoes the sin of Eve. But until the two become one in the resurrection, women are eternally inferior, and they wear a veil to indicate the sinfulness of Eve. And that means that they are no longer under divine authority. So Paul says, as God is the head of Christ and Christ is the head of the man, the woman is unprotected by the divine image and therefore is under the man's authority. So she has to say, I'm with this big guy, don't mess with me, angels, and I can prove it because I'm wearing this veil, because I now have authority, because I don't have direct authority to God in God's image the same way that men do. Now, I think Paul inherits that from the Corinthians, but he buys into it. And so here these Corinthian women are buying into the myth of the androgyne and the fall of Eve, and that she is inferior. Now you can say that is really smoking dope, Dennis, except that I can show you that Philo has the same stuff. And that this veil is a veil of modesty, but it's also of inferiority. Women need protection from the angels because they are not in the divine image.
Now, when you say protection from the angels,
Right, fill that in. Yeah.
Do you mean that angels, like we saw in Genesis 6, so to speak, might come down and sleep?
That's
with him?
exactly the tradition
Oh, wow.
that even Philo talks about
So while
in
we've got
De
10
Gantibus.
We've got 10 minutes, and I want to have you read this. I just want to say, for modern moral purposes here, just to say that whole ideology is ridiculous to me. I mean, it's just that you are inferior because of this myth that at one point you ate a fruit or a sexual act, depending if you listen to the rabbis.
We're still 2,000 years from women having the vote on this.
And I just want to say that for the audience who's listening, do you not see the problem already? No, you're mostly going to justify it and find out, no, they did eat a fruit.
Okay, here's the text. I'm reading the Bible in Greek, 1 Corinthians 11:7 and following. For a man ought not cover his head, because he is the image and glory of God. But the woman is the glory of the man. She's not the image and glory of God. And so on. So she needs this veil to protect her from the angels because she's in the image of the man, not in the image of God. Now, what kind of bullshit is that? But Paul affirms it, but he uses it in a different way from the others, because he says, if you do that, you can speak. In the other text, he says you can't speak. And in elsewhere, of course, Paul said there is no male or female, and so on. So that our definitions of gender are so different from understandings of gender in antiquity, and we all know that sexual mores are social constructions. And they differ in our own culture, in our own time, from culture to culture. So these are social constructions, and this is the intellectual undergirding of a certain kind of Platonic reading of the Bible, and so on, that is patriarchal to the core. And any attempt to say that Paul himself was a feminist is mistaken.
Right, yeah.
But any to say that he is a sexist is mistaken. He's a Jewish man living in the Greco-Roman world, and he's insufficiently sensitive to the mythologies that are determining the sexual mores.
Right, yeah. And yet, still on the better side of things.
On the better side of
people
things,
at his time.
He's pushing in the right direction.
Yeah.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, join MythVision's Patreon not only to support us, but there are 72 videos that I did with Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald and Richard Carrier, all on the Patreon, early access. You guys can ask personal questions when I go to interview these scholars, and you're helping MythVision grow.